Mr. Speaker,
present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Apparently. Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition on behalf of people who are deeply concerned about conversion therapy here in Saskatchewan. And they believe, because human rights are so important and that the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code is an important icon, but conversion therapy is an affront to that. Now, conversion therapy, known also as reparative therapy, behavioral or aversion therapy, group therapy treatments, actively attempts to change sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And we know, Mr. Speaker, there is no credible research that indicates that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity can be changed. Research does tell us that, in fact, these so-called change efforts can have devastating impacts on its victims, including increased anxiety, depression, self-hatred, compromised mental health, post-trauma stress disorder, suicide or suicidal thoughts, and many other lifelong psychological and social issues. Mr. Speaker, we know this government of Saskatchewan has in the past strongly committed to supporting the equality and human rights through amendments, and this is yet one more opportunity for them to do so. And we know that the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code 2018 names sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity as one of the prohibited grounds of discrimination. But we also know, Mr. Speaker, the practice of conversion therapy is seriously harmful to individuals and is opposed to by the Canadian Psychological Association, the World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric Association, and others. And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child indicates that children should not be discriminated against based on the gender they identify with. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. The people presenting this or signing this petition have the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan enact legislation banning conversion therapy to minors and all people in Saskatchewan, enact legislation prohibiting transportation of minors and all people outside of Canada for such purposes, and have conversion therapy included in the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code, protect children and all peoples from abuse. Now, Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition, some 1,000 people have signed this petition, come from the city of Saskatoon and communities surrounding it. I do so present. Thank you.
Recognize a member for Bigger Sask Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from the citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose an unfair and ineffective carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the Government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens of Waldheim and Saskatoon. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the early end to the school year, many students were disappointed to leave their classrooms. Though it was the right call to keep our children safe and healthy, we knew that they would miss the creative and fun environment of the classroom. To help our students with this transition, the Saskatoon Public School Foundation, or SPSF, went to work to ensure students and families would be well equipped to continue their education remotely. Mr. Speaker, in May, they began delivering cheer crates, which included everything from books, art supplies, and sporting activities to hygiene and food essentials. In the month of May and June, the SPSF successfully packaged and delivered over 1,000 cheer crates. Mr. Speaker, the contents of the cheer crates were donated by businesses, organizations, and kind-hearted individuals. In May, Nutrien provided the funding for the food items, and in the month of June, SPSF partnered with the Saskatoon Food Bank and Learning Centre to provide the healthy food staples. Though we can never truly replace the creative and exciting atmosphere of a classroom, I know these crates made a positive impact on our students. This pandemic has been tough on all of us, but for our students to have something to look forward to and get them through these hard times is a testament to how great we can all be when we come together while staying apart. I now ask all members to please join me in thanking the SPSF and all of the kind donors for making this initiative a success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Regina Douglas Park.
While the COVID-19 pandemic posed incredible challenges for Saskatchewan people, it was also a time where communities rallied and people stepped up to help one another, putting Saskatchewan's generous spirit on full display. Mr. Speaker, I want to highlight one of these stories from my constituency. When the owners of the Lobby Kitchen and Bar, Kashmir Bahai and Alvaro Santa Maria, learned that the global pandemic would force them to temporarily close their doors, they were left with extra food they could not sell. Kashmir's sister Cam is a teacher and founder of a nonprofit organization, I Am Her, that puts on workshops in schools to empower the younger generations. When she learned schools were closing down due to COVID-19, she immediately thought about the students in our community schools that rely on their lunch programs for meals. They decided to team up using the lobby's groceries, staff, kitchen, and resources to start offering hot lunches to kids in need. They called the program the Reverse School Bus and delivered up to 350 meals in a week. In Kashmir's words, generosity is our privilege, and in times like this, kids and their families should not have to worry about what they will eat, end quote. It's no surprise this important program received a hashtag COVID kindness shout out from Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam. I encourage all members to thank Kashmir and Cam Bahai and Alvaro Santa Maria for their generosity, and may we all commit to doing our part to eradicate unacceptable child hunger in our province.
And as a member for Saskatoon Churchill Wildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand today to recognize two innovators, Sean Frisky and Trevor Carlson. Sean, the CEO of Regina-based Ground Effects Environmental Services, and Trevor have designed a machine that can sanitize large public spaces and test for COVID-19. Sean designed the prototype in just 2 days, and after 2 weeks, the first SaniZone machine was built. The SaniZone prototype takes in air and converts it to ozone. At high concentration, the ozone works to decontaminate anything that is touching the air, and any leftover ozone can be converted back to oxygen, leaving no residual chemicals. The machine works remotely through smart technology, and it even sends a daily report and a notification when it is safe for humans to re-enter a sanitized building. Mr. Speaker, the SaniZone has been tested against SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, at both the Ground Effects Regina Lab and the Geosyntic Knoxville Lab in Tennessee. Early tests in Regina are positive. Mr. Speaker, Sean and Trevor are in discussions with major sports teams, hotel groups, and transportation companies from across the globe. I now ask all members to join me in congratulating Sean and Trevor in this endeavour and wish them well in their success with the SaniZone. Thank you.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The budget introduced a couple of weeks ago was evidence of a government that's not up to the job of meeting the needs of today amidst the time of COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, there were no new monies from the pre-pandemic budget of March, no new monies for health, despite the increased challenges of COVID-19, despite the thousands of people waiting for surgeries and that backlog that will need to be dealt with. There was no new money for education, despite the need for schools to bring kids back to classrooms safely and the added costs and work that will involve, Mr. Speaker. No new money for long-term care, for child care, for home care. And when we ask about this, minister after minister points to the same contingency fund. We're just over 2 weeks past budget day, Mr. Speaker, and they've already spent that contingency fund 6 ways from Sunday. A pre-election slush fund, Mr. Speaker, is not a plan. And a budget with no numbers beyond March of this coming year is not a real budget, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has those projections. He knows what their plans are for wage cuts, for service cuts, for sell-offs of crowns, Mr. Speaker. The question is, will he table those projections before the end of this session so that when we go to an election, Saskatchewan people can make a real decision based on real information?
I recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, those comments are just as patently incorrect, Mr. Speaker. The investment in our healthcare budget is up 5% this year, Mr. Speaker. The investment in education up 2.4%, social services up 4%, Mr. Speaker. With respect to the budget that we put forward earlier this spring in the budget that is here today, Mr. Speaker, yes, there is a $200 million contingency fund. Should we have, a very severe second wave here in the province, to ensure that we have the funds set aside to deal with that if it should occur, Mr. Speaker. But there's also $50 million in this budget that was introduced the other day in the Assembly, Mr. Speaker, for our Saskatchewan small businesses, the spinal cord of our economy, Mr. Speaker, to help them and allow them to deal with the challenges that they have. Mr. Speaker, there is $2 million in this budget for a self-isolation program to ensure those that are feeling under the weather, feeling ill, Mr. Speaker, aren't compelled to feel they have to go to work. They can apply to this program. We'll provide them with $450 a week, Mr. Speaker, provide them with some funds so that we can ensure that we are keeping our Saskatchewan communities and our Saskatchewan people safe. Mr. Speaker, most notably in this budget is a $2 billion cash injection, a cash stimulus, Mr. Speaker, into our infrastructure plan here in the province, Mr. Speaker. And I think the real question here to the people of this province is, as we enter the season of election, is the fact of the matter is, if we're faced with the challenges that we have, you have the opportunity to potentially elect an NDP government that would tax and close industries in the province, Mr. Speaker, and a government that believes in the people of this province's ability to recover and grow.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A budget that completely failed to make the necessary investments in people for us to have a future that doesn't lead to more and more deficits like the kind this government is delivering us this year, Mr. Speaker. The one thing we did agree on is that there's a need to spend on infrastructure to stimulate the economy. But, Mr. Speaker, when we're building our roads, our schools, our hospitals, our power plants with our dollars, we should be building those with our companies and our workers, Mr. Speaker. We should be stimulating the economy of Saskatchewan, not of Alberta or Texas or France, which is the Sask Party's record, the Sask Party's playbook, Mr. Speaker. Why, with those dollars, when those dollars were announced, was there no announcement of a plan to make sure we're getting Saskatchewan workers and Saskatchewan companies on the job?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, those are very encouraging words, Mr. Speaker, but quite frankly, history says something quite different. When it had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, the party opposite actually closed 167 schools in this province. They weren't building schools. They closed 52 hospitals in this province, Mr. Speaker.
They raised taxes.
They weren't building hospitals and long-term care centres like the one in Grenfell, Mr. Speaker, like the one that's going to be built in La Ronge, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, in just this spring alone, in the original budget that we had tried to put forward, we had a number of schools, one in Harbour Landing here in Regina, one in Carrot River, one in Saskatoon, Mr. Speaker, another St. Francis Cree Immersion Elementary School in Saskatoon, as well as an additional joint use facility school here in Regina. We've added to that with this $2 billion infrastructure stimulus, Mr. Speaker, with an additional Francophone school here in Regina, a Ducharme Elementary School in the community of La Loche, one in Blaine Lake, one in Lanigan, Mr. Speaker. There's more to do, but we are going to continue to have faith in the people of this province as we grow our economy, Mr. Speaker, and as we recover economically from this pandemic.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, since we're talking about records, let's talk about this government, this century, and the decisions that they make over and over again to send Saskatchewan dollars out of the province. Mr. Speaker, as recently as April 7th this year, the CEO of Sask Power stated in a letter in which he was describing the Chinook Power Station, he stated that, and I quote, "The total contract awards for the project to local companies was more than $140 million. Well, that sounds pretty good, Mr. Speaker, till you realize that that was a $615 million project, Mr. Speaker. That's less than 25% of the money staying in Saskatchewan. That's over over $500 million. That's over $500 million leaving the province, Mr. Speaker. Is that what this Premier thinks of as a Sask first approach to building in this province?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of the work that we're doing over at Priority Saskatchewan and Sask Builds to make sure that Saskatchewan companies, and in particular Saskatchewan workers, Mr. Speaker, are engaged in the economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, we started doing this work back in 2015, Mr. Speaker, when we brought forward our procurement transformation plan, Mr. Speaker. In committee yesterday, I let the member know from Saskatoon-Nutana some of the things that we're doing to ensure that Saskatchewan workers are engaged in the work that we're doing, Mr. Speaker, including community benefits. Mr. Speaker, last week I met with the Plumbing and Pipe Fitters Union, Mr. Speaker. I also met last week with the Attorney General, Mr. Speaker, with building trades. They're very encouraged, Mr. Speaker, along with trades in the building trades, Mr. Speaker, about the work we're doing to ensure that Saskatchewan workers fully participate, Mr. Speaker, in the recovery, Mr. Speaker, in the engagement with respect to the capital projects that are going to be moving forward in this province. Mr. Speaker, we take our responsibility very seriously. We understand that the recovery and the economy, Mr. Speaker, it's important that the Saskatchewan workers are participating, and we're going to see that that happens.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Forgive me if I am not too excited by hearing the same old words, the same old story when we've seen the record of this government over and over again. They tell us they've got a plan to make sure it's Saskatchewan companies, but over and over again, the majority of the dollars leave the province and the majority of the workers are from outside the province. That's the Sask Party's record, is an ongoing Sask first fail, Mr. Speaker, as they nickel and dime Saskatchewan companies and leave Saskatchewan workers unemployed as billions of dollars leave the province. Mr. Speaker, if the bypass numbers were like the Chinook numbers, and they've never been willing to show us those numbers, so all we can believe is that that's over $1.5 billion leaving Saskatchewan on its way to France, Mr. Speaker. And that Sask Power CEO letter, I want to continue with that letter that was boasting about less than 25% of the money staying in the project. It also went on to say, and I quote, Sask skilled trade workers made up approximately 44% of the manpower on site. 44%, Mr. Speaker. This is what they were boasting about as a good record, Mr. Speaker. Where I come from, that's called a failing grade, but it's what the Sask Party calls a success, Mr. Speaker. Is this Premier satisfied with such a low percentage of Saskatchewan workers on a Sask Power project? It's a major project. It should be our workers on the job.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, over 70% of the work that was done on the bypass and on that project, Mr. Speaker, was done by Saskatchewan companies, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan workers being engaged in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, earning an income here, Mr. Speaker, and paying tax, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in committee, Mr. Speaker, I explained, and I appreciate you didn't listen to me, Mr. Speaker, about how Sask Builds and Priority Saskatchewan is moving forward with community benefits as part of our tendering package, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Saskatchewan workers are engaged in these projects, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're
Order, please. Member from Athabasca, come to order. I can't hear the answer to anything. Thanks.
Mr. Speaker, the procured in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. We gave some examples. Large turbines, Mr. Speaker, that are manufactured outside of Saskatchewan. Those can't be manufactured in this province, Mr. Speaker. But we're confident, Mr. Speaker, in the approach that we're taking at Priority Saskatchewan, not just with community benefits, Mr. Speaker, but with First Nations engagements. This was explained to the member yesterday in committee about how we're engaging, how we're making sure, Mr. Speaker, that as many Saskatchewan workers are engaged in our capital projects as possible. We're very proud of our record, Mr. Speaker, more to do, and we're going to get there, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that over 75% of the money for the Chinook Power Station left the province. The minister likes to talk about the number of contracts when it comes to the bypass, but could we for once have this answer? We've asked so many times. For once, have a straight answer. What percentage of the money of that over $2 billion on that bloated bypass project, what percentage of those dollars left the province?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, as I've explained time and time again on the floor of this Assembly, Mr. Speaker, over 70% of the work that was done on that bypass was done by Saskatchewan companies, Mr. Speaker. Companies like Graham, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan company in the Saskatchewan Business Hall of Fame, Mr. Speaker. Many other companies, local companies who participated, Mr. Speaker, not just in that project, but in projects right across this province, Mr. Speaker. We're very proud of our record, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work on this. We've been working on this since 2015, Mr. Speaker, with our procurement transformation plan. Just last year, Mr. Speaker, through our single procurement service, Mr. Speaker, over 90% of government procurement, Mr. Speaker, was procured from Saskatchewan businesses, Mr. Speaker. We're very proud of that record, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to work to ensure that Saskatchewan workers and Saskatchewan companies, Mr. Speaker, benefit from the investments that this government is making, Mr. Speaker, significant investments in capital, Mr. Speaker, over the next number of years, Mr. Speaker. I only hope that they would have wished that they would have made some similar investments, Mr. Speaker, certainly in capital, Mr. Speaker, for schools, Mr. Speaker. They just didn't build any. Almost $250 million, Mr. Speaker, in new capital construction just in this budget, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the minister was so proud of his record, he'd actually reveal those numbers. They have been so diligent in hiding the facts when it comes to those numbers. We also know that along with the money leaving the province, what we actually get for that money is nowhere near the quality that Saskatchewan people deserve, Mr. Speaker. The entire building envelope of the brand new Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford had to be removed because they used faulty products. And then they had to replace the entire roof, Mr. Speaker. An out-of-province subcontractor folded halfway through the project and left hundreds of employees without wages, Mr. Speaker. And as we learned last week, the roof still isn't complete. If the finance minister wouldn't mind listening, the roof still isn't complete, and the patients still can't drink the water, Mr. Speaker. The patients can't drink the water. We were promised last session an audit of this albatross. Where's that audit?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is precisely the benefit of having a P3 project, Mr. Speaker. Any deficiencies that have been identified in the... Any deficiencies, Mr. Speaker? Well, if they'd like to answer, Mr. Speaker, if they'd like to hear the answer. Mr. Speaker, any deficiencies that have been identified in that building, Mr. Speaker, are certainly the responsibility of the consortium that was responsible for building it, Mr. Speaker. 30 years of maintenance, Mr. Speaker. There is an RFP was issued for a third-party audit to the entire facility, Mr. Speaker, to identify those deficiencies. Phase 1 of that work has been done, Mr. Speaker. Phase 2 is currently in process of getting that evaluation underway, Mr. Speaker, and we're anticipating the results of that evaluation this summer.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's hard not to laugh when you hear a minister describing that the benefit of a P3 project is that it's falling apart when it's a brand new building and that the patients can't drink the water, Mr. Speaker. You know, in a report released today, along with patients being unable to drink the water, hospital employees told researchers that due to flaws in the water system, extremely hot water was entering the toilets and patients were, I quote, burning their butts, Mr. Speaker. You can't drink the water, but you could steep tea in the toilets in this brand new hospital, Mr. Speaker. You can't make this stuff up. Mr. Speaker, also, along with these problems with water, we also learned last week that the facility continues to sit half empty. Of the 188 health beds, only 2/3 are full. On the corrections side, half the units are still closed, with only 7 patients total on the corrections side, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Premier is this. Is this the result of the government's complete mismanagement of this bill? Complete catastrophe when it comes to building this project, or is it just their inability to properly staff the facility, or does it seem to be the obvious, which is both?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, the audit's underway. Mr. Speaker, we'll have the results of that evaluation within this summer, Mr. Speaker. But I want to remind the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, of the conversation that they had with the Director of SHNB on their most recent tour, Mr. Speaker. The Director said, and I quote, "We were honest and said that the remediation has not impacted our day-to-day functioning. We spoke about the good relationship communications we've had with all the partners and how the schedules for any remediation work is done with patients and staff needs being at the forefront, Mr. Speaker. The patients at SHNB, Mr. Speaker, are well taken care of, Mr. Speaker. The work that's being done in there is not impacting the delivery of service at that hospital, Mr. Speaker. Certainly some challenges, Mr. Speaker. They're going to be redressed, Mr. Speaker, as soon as the remediation report is completed, Mr. Speaker, and that remediation will be done at the cost of the consortium, Mr. Speaker, not at the cost of the taxpayer of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, you can't drink the water at the facility. The toilet water is burning their butts. This is obviously impacting patients. Hear, hear. Yesterday, the provincial auditor suggested that new infrastructure is only as good as the maintenance plan for its upkeep. At least a dozen times, the auditor has identified issues with effective maintenance. She's poked countless holes in this government's infrastructure plan. And this isn't just the opinion of the auditor. In a report released by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, maintenance of our privately contracted schools and hospitals is a major concern. The workers in these facilities have raised serious concerns. Does the government agree with the auditor and the CCPA that they have to do a better job to ensure our public infrastructure is properly maintained?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'm assuming the critic for health is referring to health facilities in this, Mr. Speaker. I certainly am proud of our government's record on both maintenance and on capital construction, Mr. Speaker. We've talked about on the floor of this Assembly many times. For example, in long-term care, Mr. Speaker, 13 new facilities built, a number underway. In healthcare, Mr. Speaker, the Jimmy Pattison Children's Hospital built, the Humboldt Hospital built, Moose Jaw Hospital built. Mr. Speaker, I stand on my record for that. On maintenance, as I said, Mr. Speaker, you've heard some announcements lately. You'll hear more in the near future, Mr. Speaker. We recognize how important healthcare is in this province, Mr. Speaker, since we were given the privilege of forming government, an increase in funding in that time of approximately 50%. Mr. Speaker, that's substantial. We know we have much more work to do, Mr. Speaker, but we'll get it done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, frontline workers were interviewed for this report with dozens of first-hand accounts of the problems in our schools and hospitals. One staffer says contractors have discarded metal and nails into the courtyards where psychiatric patients regularly visit at Sask Hospital North Battleford. Another says problematic behavior is escalating because patients have to be constantly moved from ward to ward in response to flooding. Yet another says power tools are left plugged in and unattended in our public schools. And who fixes these messes? Often frontline workers, not the corporations contracted to do the work. Our staff in long-term care, hospitals, and schools are stretched to the max. Frontline workers want to get back to doing the jobs they were hired to do. When will the Sask Party government make sure the private companies get back to theirs?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the commitment that this government has made to ongoing maintenance, Mr. Speaker, is something that's quite foreign to the opposition, Mr. Speaker. They didn't get to do that work when they were in government, Mr. Speaker. In the Ministry of Education, in our budget this year, Mr. Speaker, $50 million, Mr. Speaker, 168% increase in preventative maintenance and renewal funding, Mr. Speaker, this year. That's in addition to the significant amount of work that we're doing, not only building new schools, Mr. Speaker, but providing significant funding to school divisions to do some significant renovations, Mr. Speaker. You've seen some announcements this week, Mr. Speaker, in addition to the significant work that's been announced by the government in the budget, Mr. Speaker. And if the member opposite wants to know what if that's not enough to convince her about our commitment to maintenance in schools, Mr. Speaker, wait till tomorrow, because we're going to be making some more announcements.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, that minister knows that that's a drop in the bucket of what's needed for education infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure residents of Pioneer Village were enthused when they first saw construction equipment rolling up to the lawn of their building. Maybe, just maybe, the government was getting serious about fixing up a facility that was falling down around them. But no, this government was destroying trees to make way for another parking lot. Residents continue to be left waiting without answers, and now left waiting without a view. When will the residents of Pioneer Village get answers on what the future holds for them?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes the serious structural issues at Regina Pioneer Village. We have for some time, Mr. Speaker, making every effort to keep residents there safe, Mr. Speaker, and we are committed to looking after those residents, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan Health Authority some time ago issued a request for proposals. Mr. Speaker, they were in phase 2 of evaluating those proposals when the first wave of COVID hit. Mr. Speaker, I understand they're back at it now. Mr. Speaker, those beds will be publicly funded, Mr. Speaker, and we will ensure that residents are taken care of. Mr. Speaker, you'll see announcements in the coming weeks and months on that. It seemed to me, Mr. Speaker, that the member opposite was channeling, who's the singer? Joni Mitchell, Mr. Speaker. So I think I'd maybe like to do the same, Mr. Speaker. It seems to me the people of Saskatchewan have looked at both sides now, and according to Angus Reid, Mr. Speaker, they prefer this side.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. During the COVID-19 crisis, the entire northern part of our province felt abandoned. And in that group of communities, many smaller communities also felt this abandonment. In the past, communities would contact the municipal advisor, at the very least in Buffalo and Arrows, for assistance and advice. That position continues to sit vacant following the retirement of the previous municipal advisor. On Monday night, the Minister of Northern Affairs promised that municipal advisor position would stay in Buffalo and Arrows and would not be moved out of the community. She said, and I quote, "There is absolutely no intention of closing down that office. So what you are hearing truly are rumors. We are not closing down that office," end quote. But today, staff are moving out equipment out of that office in Buffalo and Arrows. And these small communities in the Northwest that needed, at the very least, a small commitment to having their municipal advisor close to their home communities cannot continue to get that support that they needed close to home. Can the minister stand by her commitment today?
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member opposite for the question. And when I answered his question the other night in committee, I was being 100% honest with him. The municipal services that are provided in that community, I also agree, are very important for that community, and they will not be going anywhere. The member that was there has retired, so we are in the process right now of trying to find someone to fill that position, and that position will stay in Buffalo Narrows. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Athabasca.
Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 continues to be a serious threat, especially to the small and vulnerable communities of the Northwest. If the minister has committed to staffing this office in Buffalo Narrows, she needs to do a number of things. First thing she needs to do is staff it ASAP. And there are many qualified people in the Northwest who would jump at the opportunity to serve these communities. If the minister is keeping her word and keeping that position in Buffalo Narrows, at the very least to support the smaller communities, can she explain this to me? Why is office equipment being moved out as we speak? And why has this government given up their lease for the office space where the municipal advisor used to work out of Northlands College? Can she explain that to me?
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and once again, I thank the member opposite for the question. The questions that he asked today are very good questions, but as we do our day-to-day operations, you know, people don't necessarily stay in the same office that they were operating out of. Because of the retirement and because of hiring a new person, this was an opportunity to find different areas to work out of. So as my ministry moves forward, I tell you right now, we are committed to having that municipal advisor in the community of Buffalo Narrows and operating out of there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. If there's any reports by standing and special committees, I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 203, the Financial Planners and Financial Advisors Act, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered? Committee of the Whole on Bills. I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill, and the bill be now read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 203, and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 203 be now read the third time, passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 204, the Jury Amendment Act, a bilingual bill with amendment.
When shall this bill be considered? Committee of the Whole on Bills. I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill, and the bill and its amendments be now read the third time.
The Whole on Bill number 204, and that the bill and its amendments be now read a third time. Is leave granted? When shall the amendments be read a first time? I recognize the Minister.
Be now read a first and second time.
It has been moved by the Minister that the amendments be now read a first and second time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First and second reading of the amendments.
The Minister may proceed to move third reading. Recognize the Minister.
I move the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 204 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 212, the Police Amendment Act 2020, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill, and the bill be now read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 212, and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? Minister may proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 212 be now read a third time, passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll give just a very brief few remarks before this bill moves to a vote. And if anyone is interested in the details of this bill and our concerns around it, I encourage them to review the committee that occurred last night. If this government would have listened to those in the voices in the growing Black Lives Matter movement, those in the Indigenous communities, the recommendations out of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, Mr. Speaker, the families of those who have passed on, or even if they would have listened to the Regina Police Commission, the Saskatoon Police Commission, and even the chair of the Public Complaints Commission, they would have heard that in this day and age, nothing short of true independent civilian oversight is needed, and that any option where police are still investigating police is unacceptable. This bill does not achieve that goal. It falls way short of the mark, Mr. Speaker. While there are some positive measures in the bill, if the goal is 100%, I would say this bill has achieved about 5% of that. But in saying that, I think it's very important that this chamber listen to those voices, respect those voices, and as a result, this side of the House will not be voting in favor of the legislation. We encourage government members to join us, and we urge the minister to move quickly to pass new legislation that respects the calls of the stakeholders and commits to true independent civilian oversight.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 212, the Police Amendment Act 2020, be now read the third time, passed under its title. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed to the motion, please say no. A recorded division has been requested. The question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 212, the Police Amendment Act 2020, be now read the third time, passed under its title. Those in favour of the motion, I recognize the government whip.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to report that the following members are in favour of the motion. Moe, Beaudry-Mellor, Bonk, Bradshaw, Burkich, Buckingham, Carr, Cheveldayoff, Cox, Doutremont, Dennis, Doak, Duncan, Eyre, Fayez, Francis, Gowdy, Hargrave, Harpower, Harrison, Hart, Hepner, Hindley, Kading, Kirsch, Lambert, Lawrence, Makowski, Merritt, McMorris, Merriman, Mitchelson, Morgan, Nerline, Olawson, Ottenbright, Ryder, Ross, Steele, Stewart, Tell, Weeks, Wilson, Wyant, Young. Number of members in favour of the motion is 46.
Those opposed to the motion, I recognize the opposition whip.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to report that the following members are opposed to the motion. Members are Miley, Beck, Belanger, Charche, Forbes, McCall, Mowat, Peterson, Rancourt, Sars, Sproul, Vermette, Weatherspoon. The number of members opposed are 13.
I declare the motion carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee, Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report that it has been considered certain estimates and to present its 8th report. I move that the 8th report of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice be now concurred in.
Is the It has been moved by the Chair that the 8th report of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice be now concurred in. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on the Economy to report Bill number 209, the Saskatchewan Chemical Fertilizer Incentive Act, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered? Committee of the Whole on Bills. I recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill be now read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in the Committee of the Whole on Bill number 209 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 209 be now read a third time and passed under its title. Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on the Economy to report that it has considered certain estimates and to present its 8th report. I move that the 8th report of the Standing Committee on the Economy be now concurred in.
It's been moved by the chair that the 8th report of the Standing Committee on the economy be now concurred in. Is somebody ready for the question? Pleasure to somebody to adopt the motion. Carried. Was it Deputy Government House Leader on his feet?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To facilitate the work of committees this afternoon, I move that this House do now adjourn.
Deputy Government House Leader has moved that this Assembly now adjourn. Pleasure somebody to adopt that motion. Carried. This Assembly stands adjourned until, is it 1:30? 1:30 tomorrow. Right?